Continuing on from where we were last time, we're going to add Jack, the dynamic database permissions engine, to our application. We're going to start off by getting the Git repo into our app. We're going to build the Docker image. We're going to run some generators to install the necessary files, and then we'll start integrating a DSL file with our app to define the permissions that our app wants. Let's get started off by going to the Phoenix Fire Development repo on GitHub and grabbing the source. Given this URL here, I'm going to paste this into our gem file and start the process of rebuilding the Docker image. Stay with me. I've gone ahead and turned off our Docker setup, and I've added the dependency line to the gem file here. Now we need to rebuild the Docker image with this new source in there, and then run a container so that we can install its dependencies, run the generators, and anything else that might be necessary. Using this command, I'm going to rebuild the image. One gotcha I just realized is that in adding the source, I need to use the HTTPS link. Okay, so one small change I had to make during the build process for Docker was to change this directive of adding gemfile.lock because it wasn't picking up the new repo for Jack. So once I commented that out and rebuilt it, I can now see the output here where it says using Jack. Before I can bring up the Docker stack, I'm going to have to add another container for Mongo because that's what Jack uses in the backend for storing the permissions. And I also have to add this volume here and also a dependency for Jack example Mongo so that the Rails app won't come up before the container for Mongo is up. Okay, you can tell that it has failed because I'm back in my Docker directory and it's saying that it's not checked out yet. So let's see what's going wrong with it. If we follow the output, we can see that entry point fired because it said nuke server.pid, and then the next thing it's trying to do is trying to say run rakedb migrate. Well, since we're mounting a host mounted volume here, that hasn't been installed in that volume. So when it goes to do the entry point to start rake, it's not there. So what we need to do is we need to comment this line out, then go back and try to run bash again, bundle install, and then we can uncomment out that line down the stack and bring it back up. So now when we try to run bundle install, it's saying that Jack isn't installed yet. If we look at entry point, we can see that it's still trying to do bundle exec. Bundle exec isn't installed yet because Jack is a dependency that hasn't been fulfilled. So if we go back to our compose file and just comment out the entry point, and then we go back and run bash on that container, we now should not have a problem when we run bundle install. We'll wait for that to finish. We can now see the output in that it pulled in Jack from the repo as well as the installed yard. So we should be able to down this container, check out our changes to entry point, and re-up it. Okay, so as you can see, this is the output of the stack coming up. The database is coming online first, followed by Mongo, and it's running entry point. I was able to open a bash console into the container. So here's a diff of what we've done so far. We've added the dependency to the gem file. We've gone ahead and bundled. We've commented out the gemfile.lock in the build because we wanted it to actually get the new sources. We've modified the compose file to add the Mongo database on there as well. So now we should be able to run Rails generator help command and see the list of the Jack generators that are available to us. Given the output of that command, you can tell that Jack has been integrated with Rails. If we scroll down to the section for Jack, we can see all of the generators available. So let's go ahead and run bin/rails generate Jack install. So from the output of that generator, you can now see that Git now recognizes 4 new files, which we'll talk about. We also need to copy over the migrations from Jack by doing bin/rails-t to give us the list of the migrations that we'll need to get from Jack. Here you can see this rake command that comes in from the Jack engine. This will install the migrations that are created inside Jack so that it comes into our application. So we're going to copy this one and say bin/rails Jack install migrations. And here we encounter another error because before we can generate the migrations for that, we need to update the mongo.yaml to match the name of our Mongo container. So our host is going to be Jack example Mongo because that's what we named it inside the Docker compose file. And then down here as well, do that, and then we'll go back over to the container and run that again. Now, as you can see, after running that rake task, we have a new migration called create Jack powers. And here we go for test. Now that we've run the database migrations and set up the mongo.yaml configuration file, we can now start inspecting the files that the generator gave us when we ran Jack install. We have a Jack initializer, we have a new directory called config DSL, and we have an ability file. If we open up ability.rb, This is your standard CanCan ability file that's been modified to inherit from a superclass called JackMyAbility. That's where Jack ties into the dynamic permissions part. But first, we want to open up dev.rb. This is an example one, so I'm going to go ahead and comment out the one for React. Each of these create namespace directives defines a namespace for constraints that are going to be created inside the app. So for example, to break it down, this is going to create a permission called user show. It's going to be restricted by the ID. So it's basically saying that this user can see their own account. Manage means that they have all powers that are defined on that model. So by default, that would be index, show, new, create, edit, update, and destroy. Instead of creating all those permissions, we create one called manage, which encompasses all of that. So what this is really saying is that if the lead is assigned to a user, that user can perform all actions on that lead. In this namespace, we're creating a dummy manager to represent like a sales manager. They can show and update the company that they belong to, as well as they can list all the users that work in that company. Further down, we see a thing called role sets. Role sets define default roles and permissions that will roll out with a directive that I'll discuss later. So we're going to have a default role called sales representative and another one called sales manager. We're going to pass in the options specified here, and that's going to assign several permissions by default to this role. So for example, for this one, for a sales representative, given the user class, you only have the permission called show. It's restricted to you, and it's in this namespace dummy. So it's going to look for a show user permission that's restricted and scope to the tenant and assign it to this sales rep. You can read through the other options as well. Moving over to the Jack Initializer file, this sets some of the module variables for Jack. This initializer file for Jack is the binding tie between the engine and the application. We've talked previously about role-based authorization, that a user belongs to a company, that company has many roles, and a user has many roles through a join table. So this is defining all those links between them. We also have the default actions which will be created when you define a constraint. When we say scope to tenant, meaning that we're limiting resources to, in this case, a company, then it needs to look for a certain column. The initializer is going to say there's a column called company, and it will set _ID automatically. So when it does its limiting scopes, it's going to look for company _ID on the resource. When Jack patches onto the user class to provide it the ability, it's going to look for a class called ability. DSL profile path is the location of the DSL file, namely this one that we showed you earlier, that it's going to load into Jack. There's a lot of complexity that comes with Jack, and it takes a little bit of getting used to. To keep it simple, we're going to modify the user ability file to yield to the scopes dummy and dummy manager. We're going to down the stack and bring it back up and then proceed from there. I've gone ahead and mounted a route for the Jack engine in the routes.rb file. Jack is JSON only, so we'll need to make sure that we take that into account when creating links into the application routes. I've gone into the nav bar and added a link. If we head over to the app, we can see that there's a new link for Jack permissions. Clicking on it will go to a JSON index of all the permissions which were created inside Mongo in Jack based on the DSL that we provided it. We can see that everything corresponds to the constraints and namespaces we created. We also have the ones for React. We don't want those. How do we get rid of those? If we look at Jack permission with namespace React to A, we can see all of the permissions that were created that we don't want. So we should be able to say destroy all, reload, and now it's there. That's the dynamic part of it. So the million-dollar question is, how do we know Jack works? I've copied over one of the specs from Jack, the ability spec, to ensure that everything's happening properly. As part of the integration with Jack, companies receive a new method called create default roles. This references the default role sets that we defined in the DSL. Each company will go through and create roles and assign permissions dynamically based on the role sets that we defined. We can go ahead and do that now by starting up a Rails console. Using this line, company.all.each, passing in & create default roles, it will tell every company to create the default roles based on those role sets. If I run this ability spec, everything should pass, so let's have a brief overview of what's happening in these specs. It's doing the standard stand-up to create companies and roles and users and leads. It's then making sure that they have the appropriate roles, and then it's running spec against all of the constraints that we defined in the DSL file. The major gotcha of CanCan and all of this is that if you do a can ? Against the class itself and don't pass in any constraints, it's always true. You can see a link for that here. So what if we want to do this on our local. Let's fire up a Rails console. So I'm setting up some basic fixturing in the development environment here. I've gotten the first user, which is mine. It's been created through the seeds. I've gotten the role for the company, which I belong to, which is sales representative. I've gotten my lead, which is assigned to me, and I can show you that I don't have any roles. So with the shovel operator, I'm going to give my user the first role in that company. You can now see that it creates a Jack power, which is that join table between users and roles. My user is now a sales representative. Given that role, I can ask what its permissions are. You can see right here, I have user dummy show and lead manage, which is what we have from the constraint. Now I can say u.can show lead. True, because that lead is assigned to me. If I get the last lead in the company, can I show lead 2? Which is false. Even though it's in my company, it's not assigned to me. In the next episode, we'll flesh out the UI even more. I hope you stick with me. Thanks for watching.